Hello and welcome to this webinar. The topic of this webinar today is called How to Get Your Paper Published. And this webinar is brought to you by Karger Publisher. My name is Dennis and I am representative for Karger Publisher in Southeast Asia. Together here with us is Mr. Paul Lavender. He's the Head of Education and Learning at Karger Publisher. And Paul has more than 13 years experience in publication as an author, as an editor, and also as a publisher. Paul, would you like to say hi to everyone?
Hello, everybody. It's lovely to be here, and thank you to Dennis for organizing this.
You're welcome. All right, before we dive straight to the main topic, let's look at the webinar schedule. For the first part, Paul will present how to get your paper published. Then after that, we would like to share information about an online learning platform on writing and publishing called KargerLEARN. Then we will have a session for Q&A. During the webinar, please feel free to type in your questions in the chat box and we will address your questions as much as possible in the Q&A session. Also, we will record this webinar and we will share the video link via email and upload into our Karger's YouTube channel. Okay, without further ado, I would like to hand over this presentation on how to get your paper published. The stage is yours, Paul. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. Could you make me presenter, then I'll share my screen. Okay, can you see the slides?
Yep.
Great, super. So first of all, thank you everybody for attending this, and I really do appreciate you taking the time to come here and find out a little bit more about how to increase your chances of being successfully published. So I've started this presentation with a cartoon that you see there because quite often the publication process can feel a bit like this: a poor scientist over at this distant road looking far away at their paper being accepted, and then there's this whole host of people who seem to be trying to stop him or her, and you're not quite sure why they'd want to or what they're looking for or what benefit there is in stopping your paper being published. So just to explain a little bit about myself, I've got about 8 years experience as a medical editor and as a medical writer. So I've read thousands of papers as an editor, and I've written about 20 papers that have been published in peer-reviewed journals as a medical writer, so as an unnamed author. And I've also been the managing editor of Biomedicine Hub, a journal at Karger, and I'm very familiar with my time at Karger as a publication manager of these processes. So I have been at various points in my life, each of those people that you can see there on that cartoon. So I'd like to provide a very short summary of practical insights that I've gleaned from my time in each of those roles to help you as scientists and as researchers to avoid, in this cartoon, the sword dropping or the club being used or the axe or the chainsaw. I want to explain who these people are, what stages you pass through on your manuscript will pass through, and how to successfully navigate those potential obstacles. So let's start thinking about who these people are. At the moment, and this felt to me, when I was a medical writer, I had no idea what happened after I click submit a paper. You check it carefully and you try and meet the guidelines, but I think the only way to explain it to a non-scientist is it's like submitting a job application. You double check your CV, you triple check the application letter, you click submit with one eye closed, but you don't really know what they're looking for or the internal politics of the company or how good the other candidates are. And it's a bit like that experience. You're clicking submit, you're putting your work out for judgment, And it can be terrifying if you don't know what's going to happen next and what people are looking for. So that's the aim of this webinar, to really enlighten you or help your understanding of that. So the very first person that your manuscript will likely encounter is somebody called the editorial office manager. I'll explain all of these roles in detail. If you successfully navigate the editorial office manager, you'll go through to the journal editor. After the editor, you'll meet the peer reviewers. After the peer reviewers, you'll go back to the editor. And if nobody's dropped the sword or the axe, then you'll go for your paper to be accepted in the journal. So really the question is, how do I avoid any of these people stopping my paper being published? You've already started the process, you're on the road. So how do you just prevent anyone stopping the successful publication? To know that, we have to look at each of these people and see what they're looking for, why they would stop you. So let's start off with the editorial office manager. So I've listed the reasons that they're looking for to reject a paper over here on the left of the screen, and the solutions that you can take as an author on the right of the screen. And that's true for all the slides I'll present. So the first and most obvious reason an editorial office manager may reject a paper is that it's clearly out of the journal's scope. And by this, it has to be pretty clear. This could be submitting a clinical paper to a preclinical journal, or a basic research paper to a clinical journal. So the solution is quite obvious. You've submitted to the wrong journal. They don't publish on this topic or within this scope. So to find the right journal, you should always check the aims and scope on the journal's homepage. Another good trick, which I used to use a lot, is to look at your own reference list in the paper and try and find which journals appear commonly in your own reference list, because you know that they're publishing on the topic that you're writing about. You can use online journal finders such as Journal Guide, or you can actually outsource this task. We have an agreement with our friends at Inago, and if you go to inago.com Karger, you'll get a 10% discount, and they do a journal finding service where they look at your paper and the impact and select appropriate journals for you. So it's not an easy task. I mean, there are, I think, about 30,000 technical, medical, scientific journals in existence. So you do need to find ways and take time to carefully filter. So what else is the editorial office manager looking for? The other main reason for rejection would be that the author guidelines are not followed. So that the article type, for example, or the structure or the word count don't match what's being asked for in the journal guidelines. Sometimes it can even be the formatting of the figures, maybe things like the submission statements. Something that's been requested in the guidelines has not been met. Now, some journals are far stricter than others on this. This is very journal specific. And I'll tell you a story that when I was a medical writer, I had to write for a journal that told you paragraph by paragraph how you should structure your article and what each paragraph should relate to. So like paragraph 3 of the introduction should relate to paragraph 4 of the discussion. And it was incredibly challenging to write, but in the end I actually used it to train other medical writers because it was easy to follow once you'd learned it. Other journals are not so strict at all, so it's very, very journal specific. If you haven't decided which journal you're looking for yet or will submit to, then you can use standard guidelines such as those in the equatornetwork.org. This is a list of about 250 guidelines for different article types. And if you follow those guidelines when you're writing your paper, then you know that you are meeting the global standard or the gold standard for article structure and content. Another trick I learned as a medical writer is look at the journal guidelines, predict how long you think it will take to write and structure the article to the journal guidelines, and then times it by a factor of 3. Just to give you one example, I wrote some guideline paper, and the paper was rejected and we had to resubmit to a sister journal. And it took me 3 days to reformat that paper to match the guidelines of the sister journal. And of course, I had to get sign off of all the authors for some changes, but the word count and things had altered. It was a lot of work, so don't underestimate it. And again, you have the option to outsource it, for example, using a Nago, where you can pay a small, I think the fee for this would be about $150. I think that's right. And they can structure and to some extent edit the article for that fee, and then for a greater fee do greater editing. Another reason for rejection, and a primary one actually, is that the research ethics have been ignored. So for example, there's no indication of patient consent or ethics committee approval or institutional review board approval. These things should be clearly stated in the paper so that an editorial office manager can see them very quickly and easily and basically tick the checklist that they have, that's contained there. Another reason that's less common but not infrequent in journals that are very high impact is a lack of up-to-date references. That indicates that the article perhaps has been rejected from multiple journals and undergone a long review process and not been updated. So I would always suggest to conduct a new literature search after any rejections to make sure that your new submission is up to date. And last but by no means least is very poor language quality. So editorial office managers will look for this, and it's not, I mean, it's no reflection of the scientific value if there's, for example, spelling mistakes in the title, but it gives an indication that perhaps enough care hasn't been taken over this paper. And if you have a journal with a lot of high quality submissions, that would be a reason to deprioritize it. So of course, with language quality, you can fix it yourself. You can ask a friend or a colleague, or again, you can outsource. And I think the last reason for the editorial office checking is plagiarism. So this is extremely important and completely a killer blow for a paper if there's plagiarism detected. Most publishers do use AI tools to detect plagiarism, and they do give a plagiarism score that the editorial office manager can see. And keep in mind, this even includes your own work. So if you've signed a copyright agreement with another publisher to transfer your work, and then you take a whole paragraph or something to reuse, technically that's under the copyright of the other publisher. So that would be flagged in a plagiarism check as a potential problem. So be careful not to copy certainly whole paragraphs and ideally whole sentences, not to copy as a copy and paste, and it will be detected. So that's the very first person there. They're looking for things, obvious problems with the paper. This could be language, plagiarism, ethics, or it's just not a good fit for the journal. But if none of those flags are raised, then the editorial office manager, the one with the sword, will let you by and you pass on to the editor. Less reassuringly, the one with the club. Now, what's the editor looking for when they look at your paper? Well, the first thing is, again, out of scope for the journal, but this is at a much more detailed level than the editorial office manager will look at. This is really, if you have let's say, for example, we have a journal on audiology. Karger does publish audiology and neurotology, and the scope is relatively wide. But if you look in detail, you'll see that a lot of articles there are published on cochlear implantation specifically. So it's really looking at what's the unwritten scope for the journal. There are other fields that I work in where you have journals that are affiliated with a UK society that publish a lot of UK research and a US society that publish US research. And of course, those things don't appear in the scope of the journal, but it's kind of the unwritten scope of the journal. And that's what the editor's looking for. What's the journal really interested in, and what are the interests of the editorial board? So do check, has the journal published on this topic recently that you're submitting? Are the editor or the editorial board members publishing in this field, specifically on the topic that you're submitting to? That will naturally increase the chances of acceptance. Now, the second reason, which I'm sure you're all aware of, is the impact factor reason, and that the paper may be considered not enough of an advance or enough impact for the journal. So some journals do like to specialize in high impact papers, and impact in this case meaning highly cited papers, and they have high impact factors as a result. And it may be that the paper is just simply not considered likely that the paper will be highly cited. It's perhaps not a big disease area, or it doesn't present novel findings. So one of the big questions when looking for a journal for any author is to ask, okay, what's the impact factor of the journal? And really, what impact factor should I be targeting with my paper? So here you can really ask an experienced colleague. You can use a journal finding service. Again, I've suggested Inago's journal finding service. And you can also look at similar papers and see how often they get cited and what kind of journals they're published in. But I think it's important to be ambitious, but realistic. Again, I can say from experience, if you submit to Nature or New England Journal of Medicine, the most common response is a rejection within 20 minutes. They have like 95% rejection rates, I believe. So it's important to be realistic. And the third reason and final reason editor may reject at this stage is simply there's too many high quality papers. So this means that your paper may be very good, but it just happens to be mixed in with papers that are extremely good. This is more of a problem for subscription journals, the traditional subscription journals where they have a finite number of papers they can publish. This isn't really a reason for open access or mega journals where they're published online only and they don't publish in issues and volumes. So there's no restriction on how many papers they can publish. If they have 100 high quality papers, they can publish 100. But the majority of journals are still subscription-based in biomedicine. And so you need to, if you're looking at one of those journals, you should ask, okay, well, is this journal publishing well ahead of schedule? That indicates it has a lot of material. Does it publish often? If it publishes infrequently and is still very ahead of schedule and has a high rejection rate, then you can say the chances of getting published there are not low, but less likely than a journal that's publishing behind schedule, publishes frequently, and has a low rejection rate, for example. The editor, I think it's important to mention, the editor will rarely have time to read the entire paper. The decision they need to make is whether to pass it on to the next stage. And they may do that just based on the abstract, the title, the cover letter, and where the authors and the institution are from. So I mention this here specifically because often the abstract and the title and the cover letter are left to the last minute. All the hard work is done in the results and the discussion, and these things are done as afterthoughts. But actually, there's a good argument to say these are the most important part, because a lot of the decision on the editor, whether to send for peer review, will be based on these things. So do take your time here to do them well. So at this stage, you've passed the editorial office manager. You've passed the editor. This means your paper is now of interest to the journal. It's in scope, it's considered to be of sufficient impact, and it's considered to be of sufficient quality on first check. So now it's time for the detailed review, where it's sent to peer reviewers. Now, peer reviewers can be members of the editorial board, but generally there's papers are also sent for review outside of the editorial board to people or scientists who have published in that area relatively recently and are regarded as experts. So I'm sure a lot of you have received requests to peer review, and I'm sure you've received peer review comments before. So the question is, what are the peer reviewers looking for when they look at your paper? Now, the average time a peer reviewer spends on a scientific paper is about 4 hours. And keep in mind that's an average. That means some papers will take 1 hour, some papers will take 8 hours. It's a very thorough review, and you have to ask, okay, what are they digging for? And on these slides, I've broken it down by section of paper. So to start with the introduction, what are they looking for in the introduction? In the introduction, the key thing a peer reviewer would be looking for is, as a reason to reject, would be a vague problem statement, a problem statement that's already answered, or a boring or uninteresting problem statement. So to put it in other words, that the reason for your scientific study is either unclear or unnecessary. The other thing that they will be looking for is that, as in the introduction, you're building a case to say the need for your study. And if that case has incomplete, inaccurate literature to support it, then that would also be considered a reason to reject the paper. The introduction to your paper should say, this study that I'm performing is necessary and valuable, and here are the reasons why. And here's the literature to support my reasons. If that's missing, then a peer reviewer will notice this and pick up on this. So the next section would be the method section in the original research paper. And the main reasons for rejection here. Now this is really crucial. This is where most studies fall down. The ones that are rejected. The reasons for the most rejections come from the method section. So the first thing is that the study design will not answer the problem statement. So in the introduction, you've built an eloquent case to say, this study is necessary to answer this question. And then if the study design is incorrect, it will not provide an answer to that question, then that is a reason to reject. If the methods are poorly described, so materials, for example, are not listed by manufacturer, if you're giving drugs, the dosage and the time of administration are not clearly described, enrollment dates are unclear, and the study cannot be reproduced, particularly with clinical and preclinical studies and basic studies, then that would be a reason to reject. If there's an outdated methodology or technology, and that's now been surpassed by something better, that would also be a reason. If there's an incomplete data set, such as a small or biased sample set or poor controls, that would also be a reason because the results could be invalid. And last but not least, if the statistical analysis has used an inappropriate methodology or is not complete. So in the methods, those are the kind of reasons that a reviewer would recommend that a paper is rejected. After your method section, the reviewer will look at the results, and you'll see there that they are looking really here at any kind of inconsistent or inaccurate data. Reviewers do a clear sense check of the results. Is this data matching the methodology? Is it valid data? And just to give you an idea of how data can be interpreted differently, I presented once some data to an advisory panel, and this was on a clinical trial, and we were presenting the clinical trial data, and I'd spent a whole afternoon going through it with a biostatistician, and we were happy with it. We put the first slide up. The clinicians took one look, just laughed and said, the data's rubbish, forget this slide deck, move on to the next one. And they were just looking at the confidence intervals, and these had no clinical plausibility, even though statistically they were absolutely fine. So keep in mind that your data may be looked at in a very different way to the way that you look at it, and people will see things very quickly that perhaps you may not. So one question I do get asked a lot is, how much data do you put into a paper? Because studies can produce so much data. And the short answer is enough data to confirm or refute your hypothesis or study question. Everything else you could put into the supplementary material and allude to in the discussion. And if there's insufficient data to answer the study question, then of course the reviewer will point this out. They will also look carefully at the tables and figures and see if there's anything that's unclear or missing data. So last but not least, there are also reasons for rejection in the discussion and the conclusions. The key thing to keep in here is that one thing we often see is that the conclusions are not supported by the data. So this could be inferring causality instead of correlation or something similar to that. And very often reviewers do point out that the conclusions aren't really supported to the extent the authors would like, and that the wording should be more tentative or speculative. And the other reason for rejection at this point would be like an incomplete or inaccurate review of the literature. So the introduction should tell the reader why you're performing the study. The discussion should tell the reader how your results should be interpreted in the context of the scientific literature. So I'd like to just go back to a slide that I skipped over quickly before we move on. And this is really to do with the different types of peer review. So you have different types of peer review. Single blind, where the reviewers know who the author is. Double blind, where the reviewers and the authors don't know who each other is. Triple blind, where even the editor doesn't know who the reviewer and authors are. And open, where reviewer and authors know each other's name, and that's clear. There are pros and cons to all of these models, and the most common is still the single blind, but open peer review is becoming more and more popular, particularly as we move to an era of open science. So I would just suggest you look at the journal itself and decide, just be aware of which type of peer review they're using and if you're comfortable with that. I'm going to skip ahead here and just say here that, again, a reason for rejection in all sections is really unclear language or an unclear structure. Again, I think it's important to keep in mind that peer reviewers are putting in 4 hours of unpaid work on a paper, on average. And if it's unclear or it's frustrating to work through, it's a lot easier for a peer reviewer just to give up and say and make a recommendation to reject than to really plow through it line by line and try and tease out the meaning. So as a thank you to the peer reviewers, presenting it in a very clear way to make it easy for them to say yes, I think is the main conclusion there. Make it very easy for them to tease out the information they need to say, yes, this is a good paper, worthy of publication. So the peer reviewers will come back to the editor with a recommendation. The peer reviewers do not decide if your paper will be published. They will recommend to the editor. And sometimes peer reviewers' recommendations do not always align. The recommendations that they will give, there is, I recommend to reject the paper. And generally that comes from a very uninteresting study question or a poor methodology in statistics. If the study question is not interesting and the methodology is wrong, it's very hard to save the study. It's very hard to reword or rework into something that is of interest and worthy of publication. The reviewers may recommend a major revision. Generally, this comes from things like the results, some extra data, a different presentation of the results, where the author has to do some substantial work, that's clear, but that it is still worthy of publication once the work has been carried out. A minor revision, generally these are things like references that are missing, some language corrections, perhaps some structure, things that are relatively easy to fix. I mean, as a rule of thumb, you could say minor revisions could be done in a day, major revisions would take a few days. And last but not least is that the reviewer recommends to accept. Now, I have to say this is quite rare that a reviewer would recommend accept straight away, particularly if it's original research or review. Normally they do find some comments or changes that they would like, but it does happen. So the chances are that you will need to revise your paper. As I said, I think in my experience, I only had straight accept, I think maybe one time in 20 papers. And that was from an extremely nice nursing journal with very lovely peer review comments. But that's not the norm. In my experience, most papers will come back with a need to revise. So here the most important thing is really mentally to be prepared for this. Don't take this personally. That's completely normal that they will find things. Just be happy it wasn't rejected. If you see a large number of comments, try to be flattered that somebody spent a lot of time working through your paper, really for no pay or even recognition from you. Because you often, if it's single blind, you won't know who they are. And the last point I made is not to be upset by the critical nature of the comments, and do be aware that most reviewers are talking in a second language, and sometimes you do see that things are lost in translation and things can sound harsher in a second language. And so I wouldn't pay attention to that, and just be happy, like I say, it wasn't rejected. People have put time and effort into evaluating your paper, and it's quite normal that you should have to revise. So do be very polite. And I can say that even myself, with the papers I submitted, I think probably about 50% had the comment from reviewers that I needed to check my English language. And of course, that's frustrating when you're a native speaker, and I worked in agency life, and so it was checked by a professional copy editor who was also a native speaker. And of course, your gut instinct is to get angry or be defensive, and you can't. You have to say, as I would do, thank you very much for the comments. This was written by a native speaker. It was checked by a native speaker professional. But if you find any problems, please highlight these and we will correct them immediately. The second point is really to respond to every single point the reviewer makes. Ideally, use a table or however the journal requests you to do it, but it needs to be clear that you have not missed anything. That each point the reviewer, excuse me 1 second. Excuse me, that each point the reviewer makes has not been ignored. Nothing has been left and you have responded to each point. And by respond, that means you can either address it and say why you don't feel a change or a comment is valid, or it means going back to your manuscript and changing it. When you go back to your paper, use track changes or whatever is requested by the journal. And it is okay to disagree with the reviewer, but just be very respectful and above all, provide evidence as to why you're disagreeing. And last but not least, some journals request revisions. I think I've seen 3 weeks as being the quickest. Other journals give 6 months. So don't get caught out. Just read in advance when the deadline for any revision is. So this feels already like a marathon journey, but you've navigated the editorial office manager, you've navigated the editors, and you've gone through the peer reviewers. Your paper has now ended up back at the editor with a set of peer reviewer recommendations. And what is the editor looking for? Very simply, the editor wants to know, have the peer reviewer comments been adequately addressed or not? Because if they've already decided that it's in the scope of the journal, they've already decided that they would be interested in publishing this, and if the peer reviewers have approved it and the comments have been addressed, then there's no reason that your paper should not progress on to publication. So really, when peer reviewers come in, address all of their comments thoroughly. And if you do that, then you will go on to have your paper accepted. You will reach the end of the road and you will have navigated all of those potential obstacles along the way. So last but not least, the key point I'd like to make is that there are reasons for rejecting a paper, and some of these are really, I would say, a killer blow for the paper. That means it's rejected and it's very unlikely it will be published anywhere else. These are the reasons for that to happen, that research ethics are ignored, the problem it's trying to solve is not a problem worth solving, the study design is wrong, the methodology is outdated, the controls are wrong, the stats are wrong, the data appears to be implausible, or there's plagiarism. All of these reasons make it very hard to fix the paper. There are reasons that would need a large fix, such as the incomplete or outdated review of the literature, poor description of the methods, defective tables or figures. So you have to roll up your sleeves, but the paper can be saved for publication. And there are easy to fix things. Like, for example, even language quality is a relative easy to fix. It can be paid and fixed. Author guidelines, you can pay people to reformat your paper to match the guidelines. If you've picked the wrong journal, it's relatively easy to dust yourself off and pick the right one of the right ones. Interestingly, a lot of these are reasons for very quick rejection. So if you get a very quick rejection from a journal, that may not be so bad. The worst type of rejections are the ones that are very strong rejections after a thorough peer review that finds methodological problems, because that's hard to fix. So if there's anything you take away from this webinar, and I really appreciate the time that you've spent listening to me. If there's anything you take away from this webinar, it's this one, that reasons for rejection that really kill a scientific paper should have been dealt with before the study was performed. if you pick an interesting scientific problem, you design a study that will answer that problem, and you present the findings to a journal that publishes about this problem, there is no reason that your paper should be rejected. None whatsoever. So, and that brings me to the end of my presentation. And I really hope that this has been useful to you. And I'd welcome any questions in the chat, and I'm happy to try and respond to those as best I can. Thank you again for your attention.
Right. Thank you, Paul, for the presentation. It is very useful, especially understanding the different perspective and expectation in publishing. Thank you very much. Before we go to the question and answers, we would like to share about an online platform called KargerLEARN, in which was developed in cooperation with Enago. Similar to today's topic, KargerLEARN provides solution for students, researchers to learn the core skills and understanding of publishers' requirement to avoid rejections and achieve publication in their targeted journals. This is vital, especially in addressing the lack of confidence about writing and submitting papers, even they are expert in their fields. Meanwhile, since it is an online platform, it's more important than ever, where face-to-face guidance may be limited, and it provides flexibility and accessibility in their learning process. All right, in KargerLEARN, it consists of 16 courses that covers all aspects of academic publishing, and then it is developed by top publication experts with more than 20 years of experience. KargerLEARN is available in 5 languages as listed here. There are English, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and Spanish. Okay, the next slide shows the 16 courses available in KargerLEARN. The courses ranging from basic topics such as how to write an effective research papers, learn to write successful grant, to advanced courses like just know what Paul has says, what's the ethics is very important, what is ethics and why is it important in research, and to specialized courses such as publishing in humanities. As you can notice here, there are some KargerLEARN also covers important topics for developments of a researcher's career, such as how to present at international conference and strategies for marketing your papers and research papers. This is essential, especially for young researchers. Then over here, you can see the rest of the courses available in KargerLEARN. No worry, you don't have to screenshot these slides. You can actually go to www.kargerlearn.com to view the full list. All right. In terms of learning experience with KargerLEARN, it provides multi-format learning structure in each of the courses by offering various elements on formats such as videos, audios, text, checklists, infographic materials, and quizzes. Speaking of the quizzes, at the end of each course, there will be quizzes to test the knowledge of the students and researchers to evaluate what they have learned. Upon the completion of the quiz, they will be awarded with an certificate of completion, just like this. Okay. In summary, KargerLEARN intends to achieve the various benefits, including easy to access and use, as there's no download needed. All you need is just internet connection and a browser, then logs into www.kargerlearn.com. It provides flexible learning time at your own pace, and it is an online base. It aims to improve students and researchers' writing and publication skills, which will result in increase of quality and quantity of institution research output, especially in their intended journals. Students and researchers will also receive certificates of completion for each of the courses. And of course, but last but not least, participating institution will obtain periodic updates of their students' research and progress. Again, for more information, please go to www.KargerLEARN.com. It is important to note that the www must be keyed in to go directly into the website itself. Please go inside this website and have a look. This is to in addition to this webinar. Of course, finally, yes, KargerLEARN does offer institutional trial. If you're interested, there will be a survey form at the end of this webinar. Just indicate your interest by providing your contact details and also key decision and administrator of your institution. Then we will contact them accordingly to arrange, or you can contact your local representative or email me at d.loh@karger.com. Okay, with this, I would like to go to the question and answer section. Let me reopen the camera. All right. I will read the question, then Paul will answer the questions. Let's go to the first question. The first question is about predatory journals, how to avoid them. Okay, the second part will be how to choose a good journal. I mean, what are the elements of it? This is asked by one audience here.
Yeah, it's an extremely good question. So a predatory journal, for the definition, is a journal that charges an open access fee, so the authors pay, but the journal does not perform peer review, so the paper is accepted very easily for publication. Now, maybe thinking, well, what's bad about that? That sounds great. But the problem is that such journals are not indexed in databases such as Medline, Web of Science, or Scopus. And that means that the author's work is very unlikely to be found. And it also means that the author's reputation is damaged by publishing in such a journal. So for those reasons, we recommend authors avoid predatory journals and predatory publishing. Now, how to identify one? It can be difficult. They obviously have websites, and a lot of those websites are professionally done. However, a lot aren't, and you can spot things like spelling mistakes on the websites, things that don't look clear, poor PDF files, a publisher that you've really never heard of. If you want to be safe, I think the best solution is always to look in recognized databases such as Web of Science, Scopus, Medline, PubMed Central, DOAJ, the Directory of Open Access Journals. All of these databases run quality checks on the journals that they incorporate. So they're not 100% effective, but they're 99% effective. So the chances are very high if you take a journal in there, you're publishing with a solid journal. Even as Karger publishers, when we create a new journal, that journal undergoes individual checks by these databases. They don't just accept it because it's from a 130-year-old publisher. They do quality checks on each journal.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Let's go to the next part of the question. If a journal charges for acceptance, is that good?
No. So if a journal just charges to accept a paper, no, it's not good. But there is a lot of confusion between open access, which really is the future of scientific publishing, and predatory publishing, which is an unintended side effect of open access. So there's nothing wrong with a journal charging the author money to publish the paper, providing that journal is giving the services that are promised, which is thorough peer review, layout, indexing in major databases. If it provides all of those services, then making the paper freely available, most importantly, then if those services are provided, there's nothing wrong with charging the author an open access fee. This is the open access model, and it's the direction that open science is as a whole, which also includes open data, open peer review, is the direction that scientific publishing is moving in, that research reports should be made freely available. But that's very different to a predatory publisher that charges the same fee, but does not provide the services that they have been promising on the website. That is fraudulent.
All right. I think it's very important to differentiate between open access and predatory journals.
I should also mention as well, before we move on, there was a librarian called Jeffrey Beall, B-E-A-L-L, who compiled a list of predatory journals and predatory publishers. He took down the list in about 2014 from his blog, and the list was purchased by Carbells, C-A-B-E-L-L-S, an American publisher. And they run this as a subscription service now, a list of whitelisted journals and blacklisted journals. So if you have a university library and you're concerned about predatory publishing, then you might suggest to the librarian that they consider a subscription to this service where you have a list of blacklisted journals and publishers on their service.
Okay, that's very good information. Let's move on to another question. If the papers was accepted by the editor and published as preprint on the website, does this mean manuscript would have higher chances to get published eventually? Is this good news for the author?
Okay, it's a bit of a mixed question. So a preprint would not need to be approved by an editor, because that would come before submission to a journal. A preprint would go onto a preprint server like medRxiv or a university-run server. In fact, we had quite an interesting case recently with COVID where we sent all of our articles that were submitted to Karger with the author's permission straight to the World Health Organization if they were COVID related. So the World Health Organization had a big preprint server. So everything goes there before it touches a journal editor. Now, one question, so the question really is, if something's been published as a preprint, would an editor be more likely to publish it in a peer-reviewed journal at a later stage? And the answer is, it depends on the journal. Some journals do not accept preprints, they consider it pre-publication, and other journals do accept preprints. You have to check on the individual journal's policy.
Okay.
We're kind of in a transition phase at the moment in publishing, and the speed of the transition is really dependent on individual journals and individual publishers. So if you have a target journal in mind, check that that journal accepts preprints before you publish a preprint, because if you publish it as a preprint and you go to that journal, you may find they just refuse straight away and say it's been published already. That's possible. So check your target journals before publishing the preprint.
All right, thanks. Let's move to another question. It's more on your view. Okay, what are your comments on publishing in open access paid journals? Any comments on?
So my personal opinion on open access.
Yep.
So I mean, there are congresses debating for days and actually probably years about the pros and cons of open access. I think we have to just be realistic and say it's taken a model of publishing where before the reader paid and now the author pays, and there are pros and cons to it. If you're a reader, it's great because everything's free and it's freely available. And if you're an author, it's not great because now you've done all the work and you have to find money to pay for publication. One of the challenges of open access has been that grant funders haven't always kept pace with the speed of open access, which means that scientists trying to publish their research in an open access journal sometimes haven't had the money paid for by the grant for the open access fees. So they've had to struggle to find money out of their own pocket. It's also hasn't really provided a solution yet about resource poor countries, where the publishers incur the same costs of publishing an article as they do, but they have to charge a lower article processing fees for resource poor countries. And it also hasn't found a solution really to how to pay for research that isn't grant funded. So open access is the future. I think it's great, particularly as patients become more empowered, that they have access to more and more information. However, it would be great to see that the solutions for authors were moving quicker and the authors didn't feel left behind or confused by this sudden, but not so much even a sudden switch, but a relatively quick switch without enough support for open access fees. So I think it's the future and we should embrace it, but it would be great if there was more support given to authors, particularly those in resource poor countries. Otherwise, we run the problem or the risk that a lot of research in well-resourced countries gets published simply because they have access to pay the APCs, and that would really be a pity and against what open science actually is about.
All right. For the next question, what about writing a review paper consisting of 2 scopes, which the first scope has been written by other researcher, but I will be reviewing with latest update on that particular scope. Meanwhile, the second scope of interest will be a new topic. Do you have any opinion on this?
This is again a little problem with arguably with open access, that there's a tendency to combine things so you only pay one APC. If you have 2 papers, you pay 2 article processing fees. If you have 1, you pay 1. I would, as much as possible, keep the aims and scope of your paper to be as clear and easy to understand. I would not have a mix of repeating previous data combined with something novel. The reasons I would do that are that it's harder to find a journal that's perfectly in scope, and that the editor, as I mentioned, may often be making a decision from an abstract. And truthfully, peer reviewers, when they're sent an invitation to review, tend to only see they see an abstract in the invitation email, and they make a decision, I'll review or won't review based on the abstract. If the abstract's confusing, then the chances of rejection are very high. If you have a 2-pronged review, I think that could be very confusing. So I would look at the guidelines for writing a review paper. I've got PRISMA guidelines, PRISMA. These are the guidelines for writing reviews and meta-analyses, and you can see them at the Equator Network, or just Google PRISMA guidelines review. You'll see a checklist on how to structure a review. And actually some journals, particularly the high impact ones, make it mandatory to submit that checklist with your paper showing which line of your paper fulfills which point in the checklist. So I would have a look very carefully at that, and I would be very, very reluctant to split a review paper like that. I wouldn't recommend it.
All right. Let's move on to another question. Okay. Have you heard? Is academia.com a bad place to submit papers? Any idea of that? Academia.com.
Academia. Is it academia.com or academia.edu? I believe. I think that's what the question's about. So academia.edu, I confess I haven't used it. My understanding is that it's a bit like ResearchGate, and that it's a social network for academics where they can also put their papers and share papers. This is not the same as publication for several reasons. The first is that if a paper is uploaded to that site, it doesn't undergo peer review. So you cannot say that the paper has been published in a peer-reviewed journal. So that's the first part. The second part is it's not a journal. So another reason you can't say it's not a peer-reviewed journal. There's no editorial board assessing the quality. And the most important reason as well is that, of course, because it's not a journal and it's not peer-reviewed, that paper has not begun the process of entering Medline, Scopus, Web of Science. And okay, although Google Scholar exists, we have to be honest and say that the dominant literature searches are still very much in specialized databases. And if your paper is not listed there to a greater or lesser extent, it's more or less off the map of the researchers in your field.
Okay. I think we'll just take another 2 questions because it's already an hour. All right. The next question is
we can go a little longer. That's fine. So I'll leave it to you to decide.
Sure, definitely. Okay, the next question is, what are the important and crucial elements to be considered when writing a review article?
Again, I would go back to those PRISMA guidelines. The most important thing is to distinguish between a systematic review and what's called a narrative or a critical review. A critical review paper or a narrative review paper, depending on the terms you want to use, is a review paper written by an expert with enough weight in the field that they can summarize findings and give opinions and condense the literature because they are experts in the field. And nobody else could do that. That's the key thing. A systematic review could be repeated by another person because you use special criteria to search the literature. So let's say if I'm doing a review on biosimilars in breast cancer, and I say, okay, I've searched a PubMed database, a PubMed portal, using the terms breast cancer in quotes, mammalian cancer quotes, biosimilars quotes, and maybe some of the drugs, and the search was performed on this date. I received probably with that 2,000 results. We refined it to the last 5 years, 500 results. We removed non-English papers, 450 results. So if somebody else repeated that, they would get the same results that we did. It's repeatable. And that's a systematic review that's in the PRISMA guidelines. So for me, I always say that, you know, when I'm sure a lot of you have children on this call, and if you give a kid a blank sheet of paper and a pencil, something may come. But you can occupy them a lot longer, and it's a lot easier if you have a paint by numbers and you give them the paint by numbers and the colors. And the reporting guidelines that you'll see at the Equator Network are like paint by numbers for article writing. You just have to take the template and fill in the information, and you know that it's right and you're meeting the gold standard. So you'd be crazy not to use them. I use them all the time as a medical writer, because even if you think you know it, you'll have forgotten something, because these have maybe 30 points and you're bound to forget at least one or two.
Right. Interesting analogy there. Okay, let's go to the last question. Other questions we will address it via email later on. Of course, we'll go through all the list of questions. The final question of today is any tips on how to get my paper to be highly cited?
Yeah, that's something we haven't thought of or touched on so far. Okay, well, yes. Okay, the most important tip is write highly citable research. Now, I know that sounds a little simple, but if you think about it, what is highly citable research? The first thing to consider is the term highly cited depends a lot on the field that you work in. So let's say, for example, I do a lot of work in pathology, and the highest impact journal of a cytopathology paper is about 4. And what you notice is that as soon as people start coming up with very high impact papers, they take them to the oncology journals, because the oncology journals have impact factors up to, well, the highest is 180. So what is highly cited depends a lot on what field you're working in. If you're working in an orphan disease, highly cited may only be a few citations in the context of the field. If you're working in something like prostate cancer and you're looking at a drug, then highly cited has a whole nother level. So first of all, put it into context. And if you want a highly cited paper, then really do a review paper on a hot topic. Is very much the easiest way to go about it, but not so hot like COVID that everyone's got the same idea. And actually, it's extremely hard to get reviewers for COVID papers at the moment because there's so many going around. That's right. But the short answer is, if you be aware of what benefit it gives you to be highly cited, be aware what the bar is for highly cited in your field, and write something that's extremely useful that people will read and cite. And very often that can be an extremely thorough literature review.
All right. You want to take another one, or shall we?
Yeah.
All right.
And do it. Yeah.
Okay. What are the possible reasons if a manuscript is recommended by reviewers but rejected by the editors? Does that happen? Reviewers recommended but rejected by the editors.
Okay. The only reason I could imagine that happening, and I've never seen it happen, but the only reason I could imagine that happening is that the journal is publishing way ahead of schedule, and the editor simply doesn't have enough space in a subscription journal to publish it. So let's say if an editor has, let's take an example for one of my journals, pathobiology or cells, tissues, organs. You can fit about 6 papers per issue in those journals. And if reviewers recommend 12, 13 papers for acceptance, and sometimes these things, in England you say they're like buses, none come forever and then they all come at the same time. So if that happens and the editor suddenly has recommendations for a large number of papers, then it's possible they may say, look, I simply don't have enough space in the journal. Then they might have to reject. I don't see another reason an editor would do that. They've already sent it for peer review, and they wouldn't have done that if they had any interest in publishing.
All right. I think that makes sense. Yep. I think that's it. Because the time doesn't allow it. So The rest of the questions we will answer via emails, if possible, as much as possible. We can't promise all. Maybe there might be we might miss out one or two, but we'll try to provide the answers as much as possible. I hope for this, I hope everyone have a takeaway from this webinar. I would like to share my screen for a while. How do I share my screen again? Can you see my screen? I can't really.
Yes, we can. Question and answer.
Okay. Thank you very much for everyone who is participating. I hope you all have some takeaway from this webinar. At the same time, please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. Also find us on YouTube. This video has been recorded, and we will put this video in YouTube. And also, we are also in WeChat. Please scan the QR code on this WeChat. Thank you very much. We look forward to seeing you for the next webinar, if possible. Have a good day ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks. Bye.